Welcome to Cross Section, conversations at the intersection of faith, news, and culture. We are excited to be on YouTube. Please subscribe to the Evangelical Alliance YouTube channel to never miss an episode. Today, we're joined by Dawn McAvoy in the studio, where we talk about the Finding Jesus report and how we can find Jesus in the conversation of sex and abortion. This is an episode not to be missed. Hello and welcome to episode 105 of Cross Section. I am Alicia, your regular contributor, and today's host. I'm joined by Danny. How are you, Danny?
I'm very well, thank you.
Beautiful. And we have upgraded our Northern Ireland spokesperson, trading out Mr. Linus and in exchange receiving the wonderful Dawn McAvoy from Northern Ireland. How are you, Dawn?
I'm very well. Delighted to have been the upgrade.
Yeah, you have. And it's the first time that you've been in the studio. So how are you finding the experience?
Oh, it's lovely. Slightly intimidating, but I know it'll be fine.
You'll be great. You'll be great. So we have the wonderful Dawn with us to talk through kind of cultural news, political news, and of course, Dawn being our lead on both lives and the conversation or pro both. There's a conversation in Westminster that it would be brilliant to talk about later. But moving on to some great news, in fact, some good news. This week, the team in the missions team have published Finding Jesus, Identifying Pathways to Faith in Adulthood, an incredible resource of looking and learning how have those in the last 5 years, adults come to faith and their pathways. Coming to you, Danny, what are your take on some of the research?
I think this is just it's a really valuable piece of research. It's so rich. This was just under 300 people who, as you say, had become Christians as adults in the last 5 years. It explores some of the key ways that they came to faith. How do they start exploring key-ish things, attending church, reading the Bible, what came up time and time again were people who just started reading the Bible or had a spiritual experience, and that prompted them journeying towards faith. But then it also asks, well, what was the thing that kind of got you over the line, so to speak? What actually convinced you to put your faith in Jesus? It's just a really rich piece of research. It asks questions about the challenges people faced as they became Christians. I think there's so much in here for churches, so much in here for everyone who's interested in sharing the good news of Jesus. And I think it's going to be a really helpful piece of research and resource.
Indeed. And for you, Dawn, what was it in the kind of research, or even today as the team were presenting it to us, what stood out for you?
Yeah, today, I mean, it's all very new to me, but I think what really stood out was the evidence that the gospel is good news. Do you know, that people are turning to God, and primarily sort of the majority of people were finding Jesus because they recognized that they were missing something. And in their sort of in that sense that they had experienced Christians in a positive way, and also turned to God because of what they'd experienced by people's lived faith. And also actually outside of Christians, that God's reaching into people's lives tangibly and in a way that they know it's Him. So that's just so encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think continuing on in 2025, we've seen endless reports, news stories, conversations of a growing curiosity, both in Christian faith, but also spirituality in the UK. And I think this is greater confirmation of the church being bold and being salt and light in the workplace, amongst their neighbours, and just sharing the hope that you have in Jesus.
I think one thing, just to echo what Dawn was saying, that really stood out was the transformative power of the gospel.
Yes.
Like, it really works and it really makes a difference. And actually, that as Christians, we don't need to be ashamed of this or concerned about it. Like, God does the work, and like the power of the Bible as well. Like, okay, the Bible can feel intimidating. Sometimes we can shy away from it, but stories and accounts of people who engaged with the Bible, who read it, and through doing that, discovered Jesus and found out who He is and what He did and how much He loves us and what the gospel is. I think it's an encouragement for us not to be not ashamed of it, but afraid of engaging with the depth of it and actually trusting in it and saying that actually helping people to read the Bible, to understand the Bible as a key way for people to get to know Jesus and to become Christians.
Yeah, real people with real needs are being met with a real God.
Amen.
You know, or by a real God. And actually the fact that 72% of those surveyed spoke of some form of residual Christianity. And it mentions, you know, toddler groups, Sunday school, you know, a pastor coming into a school setting, actually valuing those maybe what feel like quite inconsequential things at the time, but trusting that God, through those little seeds, we're responsible for planting the seeds, but he is the one who brings them to fruit, and trusting him for that.
Yeah, absolutely. We will put a link in the bio for you to download the report and see the learning. But there's a page on page 20 of the report. There's this testimony that's just incredible, picking up on what Danny was saying about the power of scripture. And this is what Donnie says. Donnie described how he read the entire Bible, starting with Genesis. By the time I was at Exodus, I'm a full believer. And by the time I got to the New Testament, it just broke my heart. When I got to the true story of Jesus, I was a broken man, just an absolute love for what he has done. And again, the gospel transforms lives. It transforms. Scripture is empowering people, and just an incredible testimony there of just how the word came alive. So we're definitely going to share that in the link for you to follow, digest, whether you're a church leader, whether you're a Christian in the workplace, whether you are a pastor, a discipler, working with children and young people. However you're engaged in ministry and discipling others, be encouraged that God is moving in adults alongside children and young people. So moving that conversation, growth of spirituality and the Christian faith throughout the UK, there's an interesting documentary on BBC. And just a little disclaimer, if you're a parent that's listening on open mic, maybe you want to put on headphones or ask your children to leave at this moment and press pause, as the BBC has a new documentary called Sex After. And there's an episode called Sex and Religion, whereby they have a conversation with 5 people of varying religious beliefs. One who is a Christian, her name's Sasha. Another who is Jihad, who is a Muslim and a gay man. Another who is Naz, who is Sikh. Her boyfriend Adash, who is Hindu, is on the conversation, and Martin, who grew up Jehovah's Witness, but now identifies as agnostic and atheist. And I just think it's an incredible conversation that the BBC are exploring religion and the context of sexuality, sexual identity, somewhat framed more like a reality TV show rather than an educational or documentary in really learning people's belief points. But coming to you, Dawn, you watched the episode. What were your takes and reactions to just even the concept of this episode?
To be honest, I find it a bit bizarre. And immediately how it was framed that Christians or religions talk a lot about sex as if society doesn't. And I'm always surprised at that. We live in sort of a culture that tells us we are sexual beings, talking about sexualizing children. You can't pick up a magazine, watch a TV program or a film without sex being, a key part of it. That's what sells it. That's what they know sells it, So to then imply that it's only religions that talk about it as if they're the only ones that shouldn't talk about it, I thought was really interesting. And then the conversations, it is what it is. It's a TV program, and it was quite maybe reductive and simplistic in some ways. But actually, stepping back from all of that, it's a good thing to talk about because we believe that we have a better story about sex and sexuality and relationships that is brings wholeness as opposed to brokenness. And actually tying that into the Finding Jesus, results, whenever so many people are lonely and broken, struggling with broken relationships, and a lot of that hinges on vulnerability from bad sexual relationships, I think the church absolutely has to speak into it.
I thought Sasha, who was on the episode, she was the Christian representative, shall we say, on the episode. Her story is kind of interesting in that she was on Married at First Sight, TV show I know absolutely nothing about, but had a little snippet on there. And as a result of that, the guy that she was with moved with her back into kind of her family town, and they were building a relationship together. It broke down. And at that moment of breakdown is when she then rediscovered her faith and decided to go to church, be baptized, to live out her faith. And there was a lot of conversation on the panel saying, you don't do sex, you believe in sex before marriage? And she's like, yes. And the Muslim guy on the call, on the conversation was like, but don't you, don't you miss sex? And she was like, yeah, but I believed, like she was talking about, she's like, I came to faith later in life. The old me, yes, that was a way of life. That was my decision. That was decision making and choices. But now in Christ, yes, I'm holding out for marriage in order for my next kind of sexual intimacy piece. And so how countercultural that is to give a faithful witness. That's incredible.
And I've not watched the program, so that's my caveat. But I think it does actually tie back into some of this finding Jesus stuff, that we don't avoid the difficult things. And I think talk about significant numbers of people coming to faith mean we will have to talk about difficult things. And for people who haven't been necessarily brought up in a Christian environment or understand Christian teaching, particularly around some moral issues, around sexual ethics, around other areas, I think there is a role for the church to be teaching about it, and a challenge that actually to not be afraid of it, to not be worried about potentially the reaction to it, but to have confidence in what we're saying and what we believe.
Absolutely. And so if you didn't know, the Evangelical Alliance has produced resources just on that very topic. Relationships matter, both in small group video series, a 6-part, incredible, that the team, Peter's on it alongside others, kind of sharing kind of a biblical sexual ethic. And there's long form commentary and guidance. So really want to encourage that and commend that to our listeners to participate in that. So before we move on to our final story, which will be a longer segment, as always, a social media plug. We love to hear from our listeners and subscribers. So please do email in at cross.section@eauk.org. And if you didn't know, on kind of our social media, we tend to put out polls ahead of an episode. So do be checking out for those early Thursday morning. There won't be one on this one, but next week, please do look out and just let us know what you think. It was interesting to see people's engagement last week on the Harry Potter. So please use that as an opportunity of engagement. So moving on to our third and final story, which will be our most substantive conversation, is that around the issue of abortion. And just to caveat this and kind of build on what Danny was saying, it is so important that as Christians, we are brave, we are courageous to give a real biblical and kind of what does the gospel say and lend and speak into this. And I'm very aware that it's quite possible that you watching or listening have been directly impacted by the subject of abortion. And I want to encourage you not to switch off or turn off, but to engage, to listen, because there's very much a redemptive message of the hope of the gospel that transforms lives, and having a perspective of renewness in that. So let's start with the top and big question that is being discussed definitely within Westminster, as there's various amendments and there's been petitions this week. I'll come to you, Dawn, as the Both Lives UK lead. In fact, let's start there. Explain to our listeners and subscribers, what is that? Where has it come about? What's the heart behind that? And then I'll ask a question.
Both Lives is a UK-wide initiative of the Evangelical Alliance, and the name is what it is. It's all about both lives and pregnancy. So we don't come to the subject of abortion through the lens of being pro-life in a way that doesn't recognise the woman. We talk about both lives, mum and unborn child, through the lens of pregnancy leads to birth and a post-birth life as well. The reality of pregnancy crisis through a threefold framework that laws matter, that protect both lives, services matter, that enable both lives to be chosen and live and thrive together, and culture matters, because culture it is right that it would affirm every human life regardless of circumstances.
So coming to the question that is being proposed within Westminster, within kind of British media, abortion should be a human right that lends itself both to the law and to culture. How would you respond or engage with that? Is that correct? Is that not so much?
There is no human right to terminate a human life, and there should never be within the context of a civilization that wants to be humane and progressive and inclusive, because that framing would never subcategorize and dehumanize any human being. As Christians, we believe that every human being is made in the image of God from conception, and that was lived out in Jesus' own human story in the womb of his mother. So in our language, God cares about both lives and pregnancy. God lived it, and therefore we care about both and should always stand and speak for both.
And I think when we talk about human rights, I feel like this is pushing choice and autonomy to one end of the spectrum, where an individual person's choice and autonomy shouldn't be restricted for any reason, and then you're making that into a human right. In that, just because something is a choice doesn't mean it's a good choice. And I think this is where discussions around whether it's human rights or pro-choice, actually, well, choices have consequences, and we don't understand all choices as equally valid. And I think to elevate it to a human right is to say that we think this is, well, at best a morally neutral choice, but also potentially a morally positive choice. To say it's a human right is to say this is a positive choice that someone can make. And I just don't think that's something we wouldn't want to support that. I think human rights language is difficult, and it has become more expansive in recent years. But we would talk about the right to life as being a human right. You talk about rights to free speech or to association or to assembly. Generally, human rights are very high-level rights that are for the benefit of all of society. And I think this is taking that notion and that concept and pushing it in the opposite direction.
It's also literally, I can't think of another example where usually progress in human rights brings in people who currently don't have any human rights. This is the reverse. This removes human beings who currently sit within a human rights framework. So it is incorrect to say that either in international or national legislation, including human rights legislation, that the unborn child doesn't have standing. They do. So this would be excluding a member of the human family. And I think that's significant and dangerous.
I agree. You rightly spoke about there is no international law to end a pregnancy. So pivoting to Danny, what is the law in the UK around abortion in England and Wales? Let's just start there because there's variations.
Well, England, Wales and Scotland have the same law. Northern Ireland is different. Dawn can fill us in on that in a moment. The Abortion Act in 1967 permitted abortion in certain circumstances. Abortion was criminalised, and we'll probably get into this, in the 1861 Offences Against the Persons Act. If you hear talk about Victorian laws against abortion, this is what it's referring to. And this law criminalises abortion. And the Abortion Act created exemptions to that act, where abortion was permitted for a set of circumstances, up to a certain time limit for different reasons. There are Dawn's going to fill me in on the details. I think there's 7 different categories of which abortion can be permitted. However, the vast majority, I think, are under 2 of those categories. So it is an exemption from something that is otherwise considered a criminal activity.
Bring in the Northern Ireland differentiation.
So yeah, Danny's correct. 98% of abortions are legally defended under a broad, undefined, undetermined mental health ground. But it all hinges on that amendment to the Offences Against the Person Act. So I think I'll start there and say that legislation then gives some degree of legal standing as person to the unborn child. So in Northern Ireland, we didn't have the 1967 Act. So our abortion legislation was all centred around the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act. And the exemptions within that a woman could have an abortion if her life was at risk, so literally life and death, or if her mental or physical health and life was at risk in a way that was deemed long-term, permanent, real or serious. The Northern Ireland government in the late 60s didn't introduce the 67 Act. So Northern Ireland had safe, legal, but rare abortions. Great Britain, the rest of the UK, from the introduction of the 67 Act up to now, nearly 60 years, has developed a cultural and medically sort of the practice of abortion that has led to effectively abortion on request. So although there are expectations of legal exemptions that defend abortion, it's rarely denied or refused. So after 57 odd years, we have the highest ever recorded figures. Year on year, it grows. In 2019, whenever Northern Ireland had no sitting local government, and it was a devolved issue to them, Westminster acted and decriminalised abortion in Northern Ireland and introduced an abortion framework imposed onto Northern Ireland. That is now being used as an argument to bring in, and has been used from that point as an argument to bring in decriminalisation in England and Wales, and probably then in Scotland. They're watching what's happening. In Northern Ireland, a woman can self-induce her own abortion, a DIY abortion, if you like, at any stage up to birth, and there is no criminal sanction against her doing so. And there is also the context of a human rights framework around abortion having been introduced based on the Violence Against Women and Girls, CEDAW, report that wasn't binding, but activists at Westminster and others have now introduced that human rights framework. So that's where the human rights language is really being brought in, as if there is a human right to end a human life. So Westminster now are looking to build on what was done in Northern Ireland, but actually extend it further. So in Northern Ireland, they repealed 2 sections of the Offence Against the Person Act to enable a woman to self-induce her own abortion. Over here, part of the argument is to extend a third, or to repeal a third section of the 1861 Act. And it'll be, people, maybe listeners will hear it framed as the Concealment of Birth Act, but it's all about being able to conceal a birth, a death, and a body. So that would be the extension. And I suppose if we're talking about human rights language, it would be creating a human right to terminate a human life and conceal the body.
So quite a lot there. And thank you both for kind of bringing in the law. Danny, just coming to you.
Well, I was just going to say that one of the main questions around this is what happens when you decriminalise?
Yes.
Because some of the public narrative is women shouldn't be criminalised for having an abortion. It is still an offence, even if there are exemptions against it. It's still part of the criminal law. The problem is that in repealing and removing these sections from the 1861 Act, you remove the entirety of the 1967 Abortion Act, because the 1967 Abortion Act is effectively an amendment to that Act. So all of the regulations and provisions around abortion are then removed. Now, MPs and campaigners will talk about what they would put in its place, but at this stage it is only talk. They would need to have additional either amendments to primary legislation or government regulations that would establish when or how abortions are permitted or not permitted. And we have no certainty as to what those would look like. It could well be that they are removed from the statute book, which is what happened in Northern Ireland, and then it's only later you get the detail as to what regulations are going to take its place, and those regulations have a weaker level of force.
So, of course, I mean, they're saying those who are advocating for this to happen are saying that it just takes it out of legislation, but the regulatory framework remains. But as you say, that could and would likely be amended over time. So for people listening, in one respect, they'll think, well, nothing changes. But that's where, the law does a couple of things. It sends a social message about what is right or wrong, what is acceptable or not. It provides a level of justice whenever the law is broken, when people are harmed. And then law shapes culture and practice. So although there is a very liberal, and I would say quite extreme reading of current law, to send a message in law that unborn lives don't matter, right up to birth and post-birth, they can be thrown away like rubbish, to send a message that in law, current safeguards for women who are pregnant actually don't matter, that women can risk their own lives and health by self-terminating their own pregnancy. That's a really dangerous message to send, to imply that it is acceptable for a woman to terminate her own pregnancy without any medical oversight or supervision right up to the point of birth is so dangerous. So law matters in practice and in principle.
And I think that comes to the very heart of why, in everything that has been shared in terms of the law, the complexities, how dense it is for many of our listeners, and in fact some of our politicians, it's easier to kind of be an ostrich and bury your head in the sand because it just feels a little bit overwhelming. But I think the last point that you're raising there, the reality of to decriminalise abortion impacts both the woman and the unborn. As Christians, compassion and justice cares that health and the whole well-being and rights in law and protection of the state and all of that. That's what we're advocating for. We're not advocating or speaking up on this topic because we want to be right, inverted commas, is we're seeing an injustice here where lives will be, particularly for the unborn, negatively impacted, as well as for the woman who potentially goes through that abortion. Life after that is challenging. And that's a conversation that none of those who are proponents of this really speak to, of what's the post support for women who go through late-term abortion, what's the support for those who may even regret the decision around abortion. We're not having these conversations. All we're having is the conversation of my body, my choice, my autonomy, women's rights, and progressing at that pace without real consideration in the round.
I think there's so many layers and connected issues. It's not just about decriminalisation. That's in tandem with demedicalisation. Yeah. So in many ways, the removal, most of the criminal investigations or prosecutions that have happened in the last 5 years, and given the context that it's maybe been, goodness, were there any, maybe like single digits before that. So most of the prosecutions have occurred because of the introduction of pills by post or telemedicine. So you've removed medical oversight, medical accountability, and abandoned women to that fate within the context of saying abortion is healthcare, normal healthcare like any others, like it's just taking a paracetamol or ibuprofen. We have to recognize that the vast majority of abortions are within the first 9 to 10 weeks of pregnancy. But the fact that then with pills by post, women can self-terminate beyond that, and that then the law would additionally say that that's acceptable, the message that sends and the practice that it develops within the context of a culture that is being changed in medicine and society. We need to have the space and the time to talk about this and every aspect of it. And proponents of this keep talking about late-term abortions being very rare, and very few women would want to do that. That may be true, but if any woman's life and health is risked, that's something to take very seriously as a legislator. If any viable baby, even if we're only talking about viable babies, are terminated at a point when they could live outside the womb and then are abandoned and disposed of, we need to be talking about that. We can't dismiss this in the context of women shouldn't be in jail and then brush it under the carpet. Every level of this needs to be discussed and taken, and the time taken to do so.
Absolutely. And so the reason we're having this conversation is that this week, on Monday, an e-petition had reached over 100,000 signatures, where Gemma Clark, who is a Scottish school teacher and a very strong proponent of decriminalising abortion, put it in the petition that it is her view that the UK government should remove abortion from criminal law, so that a pregnant person, is what she puts in the petition, can be criminalised from procuring her own abortion. And very much the domino effect of that in recent weeks is we've seen two Labour backbench MPs table two different amendments, but with a similar intent on decriminalising abortion. And so that is due to be discussed at report stage of the Crime and Policing Bill, date to be determined upon that. But Danny, in terms of the Westminster debate, what's your reflections on what's being discussed at the moment?
It's interesting that similar proposals have come up before. They have generally been ruled out of order. So I'm thinking it came up in 2021. It was going to come up again last year before the general election preempted parliamentary discussion on it. When it has come up before, it's actually either been withdrawn at the last minute or it's been ruled out of order or not pushed to a vote. So it will be interesting to see what happens sometime in the next month or two when this does come into Parliament, and whether it is pushed to a vote, whether the MPs do feel like Parliament has an appetite to introduce this change. We are talking about a different Parliament, significantly different set of MPs, which was there prior to the election, 335 new MPs. We don't know what many of them think or would vote. So I think it is a really significant challenge. As I say, we don't know when it's going to be, but it's probably be in the next month or two that this is debated on, and I think it will be voted on. So it is a crucial thing to pay attention and to watch out for.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about what is the appetite of Parliament, I know from kind of Tonya Antoyazi's amendment, who's the Labour MP for Gower in Wales, she has over 115 MPs supporting her amendment. And I think the majority of medical kind of associations, BMA, Royal College of Practitioners, etc., who have supported her amendment, and Stella Creasy equally has a seismic number supporting her. So it's one of them at least will be debated and potentially voted on when it comes up. Dawn, what's your sense in terms of this Parliament and this conversation of decriminalisation?
Well, I think watching the Westminster Hall debate at the start of the week based on the e-petition, it was said, I think, on the evening that it's sort of a trial debate. So what's likely to be the type of arguments that are used. So I think a number of things really struck me. The degree to which the MP speaking in favour were all saying more or less the same thing. And all of them cited what had happened in Northern Ireland as justification for what should happen here. And failing to acknowledge that it wasn't a democratic decision for the people of Northern Ireland. So it's the same activists who brought it in Northern Ireland are now lobbying to bring it in here. I think Tony Vaughan MP said he wasn't aware of any dissent, I can't remember the word he used, but no move to recriminalise in Northern Ireland, completely failing to acknowledge that that's because the language has been all about, well, it's primary legislation at Westminster, it can only be overturned at Westminster. So Stormont hasn't got any ability to overturn it. He also acknowledged, or it was acknowledged later in the debate, that pressure had to be brought to bear on this the Department of Health and civil servants in Northern Ireland to enact the imposed legislation. So there's still a lot of anger in Northern Ireland. What also struck me was that the only MPs speaking against this, there were two sort of conservative patriarchs and then Northern Ireland MPs. Which I think also speaks to the residual impact of what was done, but really highlighting the differences. Although abortion has been decriminalised in Northern Ireland, we don't have that telemedicine framework, which actually still provides oversight, accountability, and women aren't being abandoned in the same way, and equally abandoned to abusive, coercive partners. You know, when you think of the number of cases in England and in Scotland that have been in relation to abusers accessing pills through the pills by post system to force an abortion. So I would say, apart from the those facts, what really struck me was the tone of the debate was, I think, was problematic. The shadow government minister at the end called attention and said this remains a sensitive, contentious issue and it should be dealt with respectfully. The substance was very concerning. I think there were general I don't even know whether I can use the word misinformation, but certainly there were slants to what were being said that I think should be addressed. And the accuracy of the conversation, the impact of the law, and the reality of medical practice all needs to be talked about.
And just to kind of round up the conversation, the episode, this is a conversation happening in Westminster, but it's a reality amongst our friendship groups and within our churches. And more often than not, the church has a, what's the word that I can say? Not a resistance, but a silencing on this. It's rarely spoken about from the front in many churches. We talk about all the other topics, from sexuality to the impact of pornography to adultery. We grapple with that, but on the issue of abortion and the unborn, the church is lagging in that. What practical pointers can we give to churches, Christians, in how they can engage with their friends, churchgoers, their communities on that? Who wants to go first?
Well, just quickly, Dawn can give the advice for churches. In our Changing Church report, we asked people whether they'd spoken about key current issues. Abortion was the least spoken about. Only 20% said that they had spoken about abortion with non-Christian friends in the past few months, whereas 60%, for example, had spoken about assisted dying or assisted suicide. So just to emphasize that it isn't something that we are talking about very much.
And I would say, anecdotally, I think we're all aware of that. You know, in our engagement as both lives with church leaders, very few church leaders have ever taught on it, preached on it, or indeed have spoken about it publicly. It's sort of a behind the doors conversation. So linking it to the conversation about sex within the context of church. I remember a few years ago, we had a student on placement with the EA, and the comment that was made was, at university, everybody was talking about it apart from Christians. So I think Christians can feel silenced, as if you don't have a right to speak into this. Whereas in our engagement, if we set the law to the side for a minute, because I get it's really complicated and it's contentious, and people are picturing women languishing in jail. So let's set that aside. But everybody, I suspect, that is listening, and certainly whenever we do any church talk, there's never an occasion where somebody doesn't come forward with a personal story, either directly themselves or indirectly friends and family. So I don't think the church has an option to not be talking about this. It matters theologically, it matters culturally and legally, but it matters very much pastorally. And as one service provider who works with post-abortion care said, this is a sanctification and salvation issue. Do you know what other area of life that is so impactful and so potentially damaging are we not addressing whenever there are people sitting in our churches who are grieving through choices that they've made in the past. We have the good news, which is healing and hope and redemption and restoration. But we also have a good news story that would help prevent other women and families from experiencing that same pain and loss. So churches need to be talking about it. They need to be resourced. They can come to us and we will help them with that. We currently chair the church's pregnancy crisis roundtable with other groups. If church leaders would like to find out more about that and how they can get involved, because it's all about resourcing them, not just to be hot air talking, but to be the hands and feet of Jesus, who are offering spiritual, emotional, practical, and material support to women and families living in a culture wherever abortion is talked about as choice. But I would say we don't currently live in a pro-choice system. We live in a pro-abortion system because one choice is privileged and promoted and paid for. And too many women feel they don't have any other valid alternative choices. So we can and should be doing much better. And if the church isn't saying that and doing that, given the context of the societal conversation, I don't think anybody else is going to.
So if you are interested to learn more about the issues, we'll put a link in the bio of the Both Lives page on the Evangelical website. And just to encourage church leaders, Christians, listeners to really engage faith on this issue. And Dawn and the team do an incredible job of doing that. So thank you very much to listening to this episode. We pray. We started with finding Jesus, the good news that many adults are coming to faith and how they're coming to faith. And we end on the topic of abortion. And it's like, where is the link? And the link is this: many are having this as a discipleship issue. And I believe that the church need to really engage their faith in supporting people whenever they come to faith to really deal and confront issues that are pain points and points of challenge, to, again, as Dawn said, to find the hope that is found in Jesus and his word. So thank you very much for listening to Cross Section. Hope you enjoyed the episode.
Hi, Alicia here. Thank you for checking out this episode. If you like it, please make sure to subscribe or share with a friend and leave a review. Till the next episode, take care and God bless.